everybody. Welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week, we're going to get back to some Bigfoot stuff. We're moving away from Pennsylvania, sad to say. They have been some of the more popular episodes. I believe my first episode talking about Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, I'll link to it down below. That one is very popular. It's like over 2,000 views now on YouTube. So thank you, everybody, for watching and supporting the channel. And I did Centralia last week, and then I did some more Pennsylvania stuff prior to that. So it's been a lot of Pennsylvania lately, but that's been my life lately as well. So yeah, if you're interested in ghost towns and creepy abandoned places, check out last week's episode, Centralia. It's this old ghost town, and there is a coal mine under the town that is still burning since 1962. So really interesting story about Centralia and just the surrounding areas, and we talked about some other ghost towns as well. But yeah, this week I'm going to focus on Bigfoot sightings in Georgia, specifically around the Atlanta area. A few months ago, I had done an episode about Bigfoot near Seattle, because on Apple iTunes, for our audio portion of the podcast, Seattle was like our #1 city for listeners. I'm not sure why, but thank you guys in Seattle. New York was #2. I'm from New York. I do a lot of New York based episodes here, just because, talk about what you know, write what you know. And so I do a lot of New York stuff. So I'm a little surprised that New York is #2. Seattle is #1. But in the third place spot is Atlanta. So I thought we'd talk about some Atlanta area Bigfoot sightings. Of course, there's no Bigfoot in Atlanta, just like there's no Bigfoot in New York City. But I did do an episode about Bigfoot sightings in New York City. So I kind of had to look at surrounding counties where Atlanta touches or is adjacent to. So close to Atlanta, and some of these stories mention Atlanta, or if you're in Atlanta, go, drive on this highway to get to where this sighting was. So for everybody listening in Atlanta, thank you. You are #3 on our list of where our listeners are from. So enjoy some Bigfoot sightings from Atlanta. Okay, so this first story, man describes childhood sighting at rural property on the outskirts of Atlanta. So here we go. This happened in the year 1961 in September, fall, not sure of the date, it doesn't say here. Fulton County, which Atlanta is part of, or part of Atlanta is in Fulton County. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I did some research before this, and I'm not sure if I'm getting it correct. Location details: near the intersection of Campbellton Road and County Line Road. Nearest town is Atlanta. Town. City. Nearest road is Campbellton Road. Observed: my father died when I was 3 years of age. I was the oldest of 4 children. Our mother decided after the funeral that it would be best to move back home with her parents. This was in 1959. Years later, in the early 60s, in the fall of the year, all 4 of us were playing in the backyard. We had our first encounter with what we believed to have been a gorilla. It was underneath and inside the house's unfinished basement. I remember tossing rocks at it, but the very large animal only smiled. Being frightened half to death as kids, we ran for our mom. After returning to the scene, there was no trace of a very large gorilla. Also, later on through the years, family members would come across very large footprints and sometimes big red eyes looking in windows at night. Also noticed half-eaten apples from the tree we had out back, some footprints and hairs pulled out from the wire fence east of the house. Other witnesses: 4. We were playing in the grass behind the house after school. Other stories: yes, just seeing one every now and then. Timing conditions was in the afternoon. It was sunny. The environment is farmland and pine forest. So let me read the follow-up investigation, and then I'll give my thoughts on this one. And this is a lengthy follow-up investigation, so just bear with me. So this is by BFRO investigator Matt Pruitt, and he says, I spoke to the witness via telephone. He gave a very detailed account of the sighting reported here, as well as sharing with me a plethora of experiences that his family had over the years at this location. The house that the family shared had a large unfinished basement with an opening to the outside. Often, various family members would find large impressions in the ground there, as well as certain food items, particularly apple cores. This particular sighting happened as the witness and his siblings were playing outside. They noticed a large, hair-covered figure under the house in the unfinished basement watching them closely. The witness initially thought he was looking at a gorilla. The children came nearer to it and began to remark about how human-like its face looked. The witness described its demeanor as calm, and its face seemed to have a smile. I asked him if it was showing its teeth, thinking that perhaps it was displaying aggression, but the witness said that its mouth was closed, and the impression that the children had at the time was that it was smiling. The children threw a few small stones at it, but it remained calm inside the unfinished basement. The children became quite frightened and ran inside the house. The witness lived at this location with his grandparents, mother, and siblings from 1959 until 1967. He stated that over the course of these years, various family members had several sightings of these creatures on their property. The sightings included watching one steal chicken eggs from a coop on the property and watching one eat apples directly from a large apple tree. There were also accounts of hearing screams and calls in the surrounding woods and seeing the eye shine of one or more individuals peering into the house as well. The witness described the eyes as illuminated and large, with a red hue. These incidents were numerous and spanned across the years. His family believed that a small group lived in the immediate area. Several of the closest neighbors were aware of these creatures as well. He remains confident about what he saw and experienced so many years ago. I found his recollection to be lucid and his report credible. There are several reports of Sasquatches using human structures as shelters. Similarly, there are reports of Sasquatches frequenting particular homesteads as well. After talking with the witness, I feel that this is one of those cases. Long-term cases usually consist of a great deal of subtle signs of their presence, but only few, if any, actual encounters. So this one is interesting. Children seeing a gorilla, quote unquote gorilla, in the basement. Not your usual Bigfoot sighting. They're usually seen, deep in the woods, in the forest, in nature. So to see one in a basement is a little weird. So he doesn't say how big this was, but gorillas are pretty big. So was this a juvenile? Was this, I don't know if this is something else. People, skeptics are going to come in and say this was a bear. The kids say that it smiled, that it had a very human-like face. So interesting. And again, kids know what a bear looks like. And I don't know if a bear would just leave the kids alone if it was, they were throwing rocks at it. So that's interesting. Other sightings, they're saying they've seen this thing stealing eggs, hearing the screams from the surrounding woods, which again, vocalizations, I can go either way on. And, the eyes peering in the windows, we hear that a lot. So you don't hear a lot about Bigfoots in the basement, but you do hear about them peeking in windows, especially with children around and women. I don't know what to make of that, but we hear that a lot, especially with children, sometimes with women, but especially with children, that the children will say, hey, something was looking in my window. It looked like a gorilla. It looked like a hairy man. So very strange. And again, the red eyes, you hear about that a lot in Bigfoot sightings, just the red eyes. So they lived there for years, looks like about 8 years, and had many encounters. In the basement is weird. I don't know what to make of that. I again, there are these encounters and these stories that you hear, and the witnesses seem credible, and you wonder why would they make this up. But the behavior of the alleged Bigfoot doesn't really make sense. Again, road crossings, Scott and I have talked about this ad nauseum. Like, why do they see headlights coming and then run in front of them? 3 a.m, probably the only car that's going to come by for hours, and they run out in front of it and get seen. Why would this thing crawl into a basement where there seems to be, from what I'm reading here, one way in and one way out? Just way too easy for it to be cornered. And these are supposed to be, intelligent primates, very smart, very stealthy, very clever. I don't know why this thing would go into an unfinished basement. It doesn't make sense, especially if there's food outside and there's people living there. I can understand if they stumbled upon like an abandoned home in the woods and the creature was in there, but if they're living there, I don't understand that. So not sure how old he was exactly when this happened, or the other kids. And kids can kind of get hysterical. They can play off of each other psychologically. One of them gets scared, the other ones all scream. And we're just getting his account, but they're all saying they saw a gorilla. Don't know what to make of that, but a gorilla in the basement, a Bigfoot in the basement. Sounds a little weird to me. I'm not saying this guy is lying. I'm not saying the story is a fake. I just don't understand the logic in a Bigfoot going into a basement where it's essentially trapped. Because if it weren't children, this could have been a guy with a shotgun who found this creature and killed this thing. I don't know why it would have crawled into the basement. And they're seeing them on the property, so there's possibly more than one. Interesting, but not sure what to make of this one. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Bigfoot in the basement. Very, very strange. Okay, this next one's a very short story, but wanted to talk about it. Loud howling vocalizations heard by residents near Lake Alatoona. And this is from, it was on May 8th, 1999, day after my birthday. County is Cobb County. This is in Ackworth, Georgia. Observed, he says, my wife and I were leaving my parents' home located on the edge of Lake Alatoona. While saying our goodbyes outside, the four of us heard an extremely long and loud howl. The howl lasted about 5 minutes, causing several dogs in the area to begin barking and howling themselves in response to the strange howl. The unknown howl wasn't a dog due to the length of the howl and tone. After reviewing the recordings referenced on your homepage, both my parents, wife, and I believe that the howl of the creature in these recordings was almost a perfect match. I'm going to throw that howl in here just so you guys can hear it. I know which one he's talking about. It almost sounds like a siren. It's just this long, and you hear dogs barking in the background. So it sounds very similar to this story. So listen to that, and then we will continue. So he says, other witnesses, my wife and I had dinner with my parents and were leaving to go home. Please note that no alcohol was consumed by any of us. I'm going to come back to that. Environment, rural location on the edge of Lake Alatoona, the beginning edge of Red Top Mountain foothills. So to go back to this alcohol thing for a second, we hear this a lot from skeptics too. You see a UFO, you see Bigfoot, were you high, were you drinking? And certain drugs will make you hallucinate. Alcohol doesn't really do that. Marijuana doesn't really do that. Plenty of people in large cities get drunk on a nightly basis. There's bars, there's drugs, there's cocaine, there's marijuana. Nobody reports seeing Bigfoot on the subway. Nobody reports seeing Bigfoot in dark alleys of New York City. I don't get why people automatically go to, well, you must have been drunk. You must have been high to see Bigfoot, to see a UFO. You'd have to be real high to see that. You'd have to be real drunk to hallucinate that. I appreciate him saying that there's no alcohol, but you can kind of see where he's sort of like kind of trying to cut the critics off before they could even get in there. Like, no, we weren't drinking. So before you even go there, we weren't drinking. And he didn't even see anything. He's just hearing this long howl. And again, I don't usually put a lot of credence into vocalizations. I've heard a vocalization. I'll link to that episode down below, Bigfoot Howls in New York. That sounded very weird. I will never say 100% it was Bigfoot. I don't know, but I've heard some weird stuff, and it wasn't a bird. The bird would have been the size of like Rodan. But he's saying this sounds like the howl that I played, the one that's on this website. So that's interesting to me, just when people can sort of hear something and say, yeah, that's what I heard. I have not been able to find similar recordings online of what I heard. And we checked normal animals. We checked known animals in New York State, coyotes and moose and bear and owls. And what we heard was not anything known that I could find anyway, or resembling anything known. So who knows, but also nothing on this site. So was it Bigfoot? Who knows? But this was a cool story just because he linked it back to that other howl. Okay, so we go from a very short story to a much longer narrative here. So let me read this one, and bear with me. Like I said, this is a little bit lengthy, but hopefully enjoyable. Early evening encounter near Riverdale. So this happened in July of 1984 in Clayton County. Location details. If you are in Atlanta, you go 75 south to Georgia Highway 85 and you follow it into Riverdale. Highway 85 eventually intersects Highway 138. At that light, make a right, go straight to the 3rd Street on the left, and that is Lyle Drive. Nearest town is Riverdale. Nearest road is Highway 138. And observed. I am now 33 years old. At the time that I encountered this creature, I was 13. I will write it as it happened. Me and my family lived in a rural community on the outskirts of Riverdale, Georgia. Behind our house, there were many acres of woods. At that time, the area belonged to a man named Mr. Jackson. There was a huge lake there also. It was called Jackson's Lake. Mr. Jackson was a cattle farmer. His cattle were on the other side of the lake. There were many trails in those woods, and me and my friend Daniel played in them many, many times. It was very easy to lose yourself out there all day. My encounter happened when I walked through these woods to a trailer park that was called Chateau Manor. The trailer park still exists today, but is under a different name. I went to visit a friend. I started to notice that it was getting late, and my father had told me that he did not want me in those woods after dark. This struck me and my mother as strange because we would always be in the woods. My mom would even go in those woods to pick blackberries. At any rate, I decided to obey my father, as I did not want to hear his mouth. I walked to the back of the trailer park, and there you have to cross a big ravine. It is like 10 to 15 feet down and then up again. I was covered in vegetation and that Georgia red clay. Down in the ravine was a creek, so you would get a little scuffed up. After I crossed that, I went up a trail that went up the hill by the lake that curved around and led to my house. After passing the lake and turning the curve, I encountered my father. He said, "What are you doing out here?" I said, "I was just coming back from Pam's house." He said, "Well, hurry up and get home." Left him standing there and started for home. I turned back to see what he was doing, and he was walking towards the lake. I just kept walking towards my house. When on my right side, I heard rustling in the foliage beside me. The foliage was mostly dense, tall pine trees with all kinds of honeysuckles and blackberry vines and muscadine vines. I'm not sure what that is. That was the place where me and Mom would come to pick the blackberries. I turned and looked, and I saw this creature. This thing was massive. I could see him. He was only a few feet away from me. He stood parallel to me. I was heading north to my house. He too was face north. I was on a heavily walked clear trail, whereas he was in the shrubs. These little pine trees were taller than him. He was at least 7 to 8 feet tall. His arms were huge, like the size of thighs. They were very long. His chest was massive as well. This was no skinny creature. I looked at him, he looked at me, and off I went running up the trail. I was so scared. When I started to run, he did too. He ran right beside me in the shrubs. I would look to my right and see him, and the thing would make a loud sound. It's like he would exhale and let out a very deep grunt/roar. I kept running, and he kept running beside me in the shrubs. This thing was completely hairy, and its face was dark, but I could tell it was human-like because its head was like that of a human head, but hair all over, but not on the face. When I had reached the part of the trail that forked off into an open field of tall grass, wheat-like stuff, this is where he stopped. He would not come out of the shrubbery. I looked back and seen him crouched there staring at me as I ran, and he just was there in the shrubbery. When I made it home, I ran into the house shaking like a leaf, and my mom was making supper. I told her what had happened and what I had seen, and she went to look out the dining glass window. It was a sliding glass window, and she said she didn't see anything. She asked where my father was, and I told her. Then she sat down with me at the dining room table and told me that was the reason that he did not want me in those woods. She said that he had told her that he had hemmed it up a tree one night and that he just stood there in front of it and screamed at it and it wouldn't come out of the tree. I never told anyone other than my mother and Daniel and now my 4 boys about that. But there was something in those woods, and me and my father weren't the only ones that knew it. One day I was watching TV after school. This was before any of this happened. And my father came in and told me to come and help him. I said, "Why?" Me and my father do not get along very well. He said because Benji, our dog, had got caught in a bear trap on the other side of the lake. I said, "What?" He said, "Yes." So we went and tried to free Benji, and my father had taken a machete. He said he could not open the trap, so he was going to cut his foot off. I said no, so I pulled the trap with all my might, and my father got Benji out. Now, why had someone set a bear trap in the woods? There are no bears in Georgia. The biggest animal besides that thing I had seen were deer and cows, and the cows were on the other side of the lake. They could not come across one side because of trees and the other side because of a big steel fence. And other times, before I had ever encountered this being, me and my family would go walking in the woods, and sometimes we would cross the steel gate over to Mr. Jackson's land and trek out about a mile to a very sandy, clear creek. That was the side where the cows were. On many different occasions, we would come upon a cow laying on the ground dead with its whole stomach torn out. That was very weird to me, but because I was young and didn't know much, and since my parents didn't say much, I never put two and two together until my later 20s. There was something in those woods, but it's probably long gone by now. There are houses all around that lake, and Mr. Jackson no longer lives in his house. The creek where these things happened is called Camp Creek. The lake was called Jackson's Lake. It was private to him, although me and Daniel would always play around in the woods and the lake. The name of the street was and is Lyle Drive. The town, Riverdale, Georgia, I will never forget when that creature chased me. When I got to that opening, I knew that he didn't want to hurt me, because I know by his massive size and that massive sound that he could have just ripped me apart had he wanted to. Needless to say, that I didn't go in the woods much after that. You are the first people that I've ever told, besides my mom and my friend and my kids. Other witnesses, me and my father, but on separate occasions. He says it was about 8 o'clock at night, getting dark. As I ran, the sun hit me in the back. The environment, many pine trees and woods, and a lake with many cows. So the follow-up investigation by BFRO investigator Lee Culver. I met with the witness to discuss her experience. She is very credible. Though her experience occurred when she was 13, she remembers the encounter well. During the encounter, the animal was as close as 20 feet. Throughout the incident, the creature seemed to remain in a somewhat crouched position even while running alongside her. She is currently 5 foot 4 inches tall and was close to that height at age 13. The creature's shoulder, while in this crouched position, came to the height of her head. She described the creature as being very massive and muscular, and this was the primary trait that most impressed her. She also described the creature's hair as about being 3 to 4 inches long and being a glowing auburn, reddish-brown, almost orange color. The face was human-like and was darker brown, almost black in color. The eyes were dark, the nose was wide, and the lips were not thick, with the upper lip being very wrinkled. In drawing the shape of the head, the witness drew what could be interpreted as a possible sagittal crest. The creature, while running, apparently crashed through small pines and shrubs effortlessly, knocking them down. Once the witness reached a clearing, the creature did not venture out from the vegetation and remained in a position of cover. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Definitely sounds like she was being paralleled, but most people being paralleled don't see what's paralleling them. They hear it. They hear the footsteps. They take some steps. They hear something else taking steps. And usually when they stop, there's like an extra step. Almost like whatever's paralleling them doesn't quite know when they're going to stop. How could it? So very similar. And then you hear something else, but she is saying she saw this creature. Now to go back to what she said about how there's no bears in Georgia, there are. There's sort of isolated populations in Georgia, so not technically throughout the state, but they do wander, they do migrate. So I just wanted to clarify that because some people in the comments may say, hey, Georgia does have bears. So she was a little mixed up on that because she's saying, why would anybody place a bear trap? There are bears in Georgia, maybe not in her particular area, but it's always possible they can move through. And I checked this out online, and it does say that, yeah, they're in pocketed areas, but they do move throughout the state at times. So it's possible that bears could be there. It's not that there are no bears in Georgia. That being said, I don't think, even at 13, that's young, but from what she is describing, this is not a bear. She's describing something upright, running on 2 legs, muscular legs, long arms, a human-like face. Again, a 13-year-old is going to know what a bear looks like. Even if she was scared, a bear's going to run if it's running after her on 4 legs, not on 2. Bears will take a couple of steps when they stand up, but they're not going to run, and they're not going to walk very far. They're going to take a few steps, and that's it. And interesting, again, that once she exits the woods and gets into like this clearing, the creature stops. Again, it knows it's going to lose its cover. So it stops and she keeps going. And we hear this a lot too. A lot of people who claim to have encountered Bigfoot, when asked if they thought they were in danger, they're scared, but a lot of them will say after the fact, like, if this thing wanted to kill me, it would have. I wouldn't be here telling the story. Like, it was fast. It was big. If it wanted to kill me, if it wanted to catch me, it could have. So a lot of these behaviors seem to be sort of escorting the witness away from its territory, escorting it out of the woods. So there's that. you always want to pay attention to that these creatures very easily could. So I like that part of her story, because you do hear that in a lot of these encounters where people will say, this thing, if it wanted to kill me, it could have. Like, I would not be here. It just would have killed me, and I wouldn't have been able to run away from it. So it's not really, it's aggressive behavior, but it's not something I think necessarily that these people are in danger of. But yeah, his arms were huge, the size of thighs. And you hear that a lot, that just these very thick arms, big chest. It wasn't a skinny creature. And again, some people will describe skinnier creatures, especially down south. And, maybe Georgia's just north enough where it's not too skinny. I don't know. But she's saying this was not a skinny Bigfoot. It was a thicker, bulky Bigfoot. So interesting that her father kind of warned her about this without specifically warning her about this, just saying, stay out of the woods. The cows having their stomachs torn out. Again, the coyotes or bear or other predators, big cats, it's always a possibility. So it's to rule those things out for this collateral sort of stuff, I don't think you can do that. I don't think you could say it's necessarily Bigfoot. If she saw what she says she saw, that's not a bear, even though bears are in Georgia. So I'll leave it at that. Again, I hate the bear debate and talking about bears, and but I did want to clarify, because she said there are no bear in Georgia, and there are. So not saying that that's what she saw, but just to clarify her statement. And I had hoped that the follow-up investigation would have spoken about that and sort of clarified for anybody else reading this, because not everyone is going to go and say, hey, are there bears in Georgia? I did, and very quickly you can see that there are bears in Georgia, and they do wander throughout most of the state, even though their populations tend to cluster in like 3 specific areas. But it's always possible. So just wanted to talk about that, and we'll move on to the next story. Okay, so the last 2 stories I'm going to talk about tonight come from Gwinnett County in Georgia. And this one is from August 13th of 1999. Possible vocalizations near Plunketts Road outside of Buford. Location details. There is a stream that runs deep into the woods. I don't know how far back it goes. Nearest town is Buford. Nearest road is Plunketts Road. Observed. My wife, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, and myself were sitting in the breakfast nook overlooking the backyard. We were all talking and had just finished dinner. All of a sudden, a very loud, deep shriek started coming from just about beyond the tree line. We all jumped up, and as the ladies looked out the window, my brother-in-law and I ran down to the patio out back. On the way, I grabbed my rifle that I kept near the back door. Anyway, he and I stepped outside, and these blood-curdling shrieks kept happening. He grabbed a flashlight, and when he pointed it at the tree line, the shrieks stopped, and we heard something tear through the woods, grunting very deeply as it went. The next day, I went into the woods to look for tracks. I found none, but there was a huge trail torn through them. I followed it for a very long way by myself. After about 2 hours of following this trail, even though armed, I got creeped out and headed back to the house. The tree damage was astonishing. I've been around bears and mountain lions before. Whatever that thing was, that night was not one of those, and I'm not nuts. I never went back into those woods again without my rifle, and I've never in my life heard anything so scary or seen such damage done to trees by an animal in the deep south ever. I will never forget that night, and I will never go hiking or camping unarmed, or armed for that matter. Also noticed, it almost felt like this thing was trying to get our attention. I mean, if it's screaming. Other witnesses, wife, brother, mother, and sister-in-law. Other stories, no, that he was aware of. Time and conditions, it was a clear, warm, still night. Environment, pine forest, and a winding creek. And the follow-up investigation, again by BFRO investigator Lee Culver. I spoke with a witness who recounted his story as presented in the report. The vocalizations occurred near Knoll Crest Trail and Plunketts Road off of Buford Drive. The witness described the vocalizations as being very loud. The witness is very familiar with the vocalizations that various wilderness animals make, including those of bobcats and mountain lions. He stated that the vocalizations that he and the other witnesses heard that night were unlike anything he has ever heard before or since that time. The next day, the witness investigated the area where the vocalizations originated from. In this vicinity, he found an area where something had torn through the woods. He said that there was a pathway of destruction or hole through the woods about the size of a small car where small trees and saplings had been freshly knocked down as if something was trying to make a point as it departed. Trees that were not knocked down had their tops twisted and broken off and thrown to the side. This area has seen considerable development in recent years. It was much less developed in 1999. So, interesting story. You have the vocalizations, which again, for me, I'm always on the fence about. They can be interesting, but not usually super impressive. But this story sounds a little bit more impressive just because you have this, sort of collateral damage in the woods of just this big trail, like something big crashed through it. And it kind of reminded me of Les Stroud's story when he was in Alaska and he was setting up his tent out in a clearing, and from like right inside the wood line, he heard like this grunting and growling and shrieking, and then the trees were moving and like something very large had moved through there. So again, if it was a bear, you're talking a black bear, which they're not terribly large. I mean, they're big and you don't want to get on one's bad side, but you're not talking a grizzly. You're not talking a big brown bear or Kodiak bear, polar bear, like very large bears. Black bear don't get super huge. Again, is it possible? Of course, but this guy saying never heard anything before or after like that, is very familiar with things in the woods and what they sound like. And again, bobcats, mountain lions, fishers, foxes, all sorts of these things can have very creepy howls. They're not usually guttural, though. They're usually more high pitched. So when you hear these stories about it, it sounds like a woman crying, it sounds like a child crying or screaming. Those I typically tend to think are known animals, probably fishers or foxes or bobcats. But the people who hear these like more guttural, longer shrieks and howls, those are more interesting to me because a little fisher or a little fox is not going to have a deep, guttural howl or shriek. So very interesting. And again, he grabs his rifle. This is not someone who's afraid of a fox or, he's bringing a gun and he's saying he'll never go out into the woods again, armed or unarmed. He's not going to go camping or hiking, which is a shame. But it's another thing we hear from people, a lot of outdoors people who are familiar with the outdoors, who love the outdoors, who go camping, who've been hunting since they were teenagers, 40, 50, 60 years, have an encounter, and then they're like, nope, I'm done. I'm giving up this thing that I've loved my entire life. And, just not doing it again because of what I saw. These guys didn't see anything, but they heard something. Very freaky. Again, not sure what to make of it, but from the sound of it, it's not something I'd want to hear. Blood-curdling shrieks. What do you guys think? All right, so our last story for the episode, also from Gwinnett County in Georgia. This is another long one, so bear with me. Witness recounts he and his friends encounter with a strange creature along with strange sounds and footprint finds. And this is from March of 1974, so shortly before I was born, Gwinnett County. Location details: 7 miles from the Chattahoochee River, a couple of miles from Norcross. Nearest town is Norcross. Observed: the incident took place in Gwinnett County, a couple of miles away from Norcross. The area used to be much more residential and undeveloped than it is now. The Chattahoochee River was about 7 miles away. I assume that this creature had made its way from that direction. I had consequently learned that the area has had several incidents of sightings over the years previous to mine. The events that led up to my sighting occurred over a 4-month period in the spring of '74. Since then, I have always wished that I could get up close to the creature. The incident started one day in a swampy area. My friends and I were building a fort with bamboo stalks when we noticed that the animal sounds in the woods had disappeared. It was deathly quiet. Then we heard a large branch snap. We got scared as the sound had come from only 50 to 75 feet behind us in the swampy part of the bottoms. We imagined a psychopath with a large knife and proceeded to quietly leave the area in single file. That is when we heard the animal scream and run towards us by the sound of the stomps in the leaves. Afterwards, we discussed what could possibly have made such a noise. A monster? What? We did not know. But somewhere in the conversation, the possibility of a Bigfoot came up, and that seemed more plausible to our 14-year-old minds. In the subsequent weeks, we found tracks, 5-toed and 3-toed, but never a trail of them. We would hear far-off animal sounds and such. We even found an area of pushed-down grasses a few days later, in the spot we figured the screams had come from. We had mounted an expedition to look for the creature a few days after the initial incident and had left our shoe prints in the mud and sand. A couple of days after that, a few of us went back, and we discovered something very peculiar. In addition to 3-toed tracks, we found a series of tracks that looked like the bare feet of children, following our trail of footprints. I am convinced to this day that the creature had screamed at us was probably a female with babies. This was the only time we found a trail of tracks. Another time we had found, further back in the woods, a large footprint shape with no discernible features such as toes, etc., on the side of a small creek. On the other side, we found another in the mud, which appeared to be the opposite foot. These 2 footprints were several feet away from each other, a big step. I have a picture of the second print, so a long stride is what they're saying. Anyhow, my friend Mike and I would walk up to the bus stop in the early morning hours as the dawn began to eventually brighten the sky. He came to my house one morning with an excitement in his voice as he told me that he had seen the shadow of the creature across his backyard as he got dressed. He lived just 2 doors over, and there was a section of woods that ran up behind the houses. He told me that he heard our neighbor's dog barking wildly and could hear the creature running through the woods behind the houses. I wasn't sure if he could be believed, but I was too excited by the prospect to be skeptical. As we walked to the bus stop, we proceeded to look back down the street our cul-de-sac turned off of, as it dead-ended at a petroleum pipeline field with the swamp on the other side. There was also some woods on the left side of the street, with a strip of cleared ground between the edge of the woods and the street. There was one street lamp on a telephone pole down near the end of the road on the left side, and it was under this lamp that we noticed a large cone-shaped dark area. We knew that there had been no mound of dirt or sticks there before, just level ground. As we watched, the mound decided to stand up and walk toward the end of the street. However, it turned, picked something off the ground, and ducked into the strip of woods there. As we were about 300 feet from the creature, it appeared dark gray like a shadow. I grabbed Mike's sleeve and said, "We got to get closer." Of course, he didn't want to. The creature was estimated to be 7 foot tall and quite skinny. It had wide hips, and its arms were almost to its knees. It also had what appeared to be a sagittal crest at the top of its head. I don't know what color it was, but I would guess from what I subsequently learned about previous sightings in the area and from Grover Krantz's book that it must have been white. It would make sense, would it not, that Krantz's rogue males group might very well include any albinos or others with different traits from the majority of Sasquatch apes that may very well be shunned into a life of wandering the rest of the North American continent. Easy for me to say. On one morning, I believe it may have been that fall, we were walking, Mike and I, up to the bus stop and heard a far-off 2-tone call from the swamp. And that's interesting. The 2-tone, I talked about this a couple episodes back, Bigfoot Sightings in Pennsylvania, part 2, I believe, where people will hear these howls or shrieks, and they say it sounds like multiple voices. It's one shriek, but there's like different tones in it. There'll be like a higher pitch tone and a lower guttural, and it's kind of mixed together. It's not just one voice. So very strange. To continue, I answered back, and in a few seconds we heard it again, but this time it seemed to be closer, not so far off. I called again, and immediately we heard a return call, again much closer, as if the creature were moving through the swamp toward us. I called again, and this time it sounded as if it were at the edge of the swamp. Then my stepfather yelled at us out their bedroom window, which was in front of the house, second floor. They often had their windows open in fair weather. All right, I yelled, and a few moments later we heard the call again, this time coming from far, far away as the first call had been. It was a 2-toned call, a high-pitched note that turned into a low-pitched note. It was definitely a call of some sort. Also noticed, one morning, it was still dark, we walked up to the bus stop, looking back at the swamp. We saw an orange flash of diffused light spread up and out over the sky above the swamp. Duration was about 2 seconds. Flash lightning, swamp gas. Time and conditions. The initial incidents occurred in March and continued for 4 months or so. The sighting took place in the morning while it was still dark. The calls were heard in the morning, but it was light outside when we went to the bus stop a few months later. So the environment, pine forest, creek bottom, somewhat sandy and muddy, very thick underbrush, swamp-like. There were many large creeks in the area, a sewage treatment plant, a heavily forested areas to the north and east of the swamp, which is probably only a half-mile square. We also found some evidence in the swamp of its previous history. Upright ties 15 feet high from the ground, part of an old wall. There were 3 of them about 10 to 15 feet apart in a row. Further back, we found an old rotting outhouse. Then further back still, we found a skinny mound of earth that went straight for several hundred feet. Off of this, we found some pea plants. The creek in the swamp near where we first encountered the creature's screams seemed to have been man-made. Like a small irrigation ditch, it was about 3 feet wide, had vertical sides and a flat bottom. Altogether, a very strange place. So this one, there are parts of it I kind of dig, and there are parts of it that just make me wonder if this is childhood hysteria, kids scaring each other. They have a frightening encounter and then they start talking about Bigfoot, and then everything they see is now Bigfoot, or everything they hear is Bigfoot, and every shadow is Bigfoot. The interesting thing is how it starts when they're in the woods building this fort and all the animal sounds stop. We hear that a lot in Bigfoot encounters. Just the ambient noise just stops. If it's nighttime, it's the crickets and the frogs. During the day, it'll be like the birds and the squirrels and the little scampy creatures. But whatever it is, it's the animal life in the woods, in the forest, will just stop dead. Like they know there's something there. And again, people will talk about this happening before they see a creature. So they're not necessarily expecting, it's not like their senses are shutting down. Again, psychologically, when we are in a fight or flight mode or in a traumatic mode, anybody who's been in a car crash or a car accident or anything traumatic will tell you that like their other senses almost drop out. Like they won't hear things. Their sense of smell will go away because they're laser focused on what they're seeing or what they're hearing. So all the other senses kind of turn off almost. And the one sense that is being stimulated will become like hyper aware. And that would be fine if they're seeing the creature. And then, they say, well, I didn't hear anything. And, maybe they did, they just don't remember. But in most of these cases, it's not that they're experiencing something traumatic, like seeing a Bigfoot. It's just, they notice like, oh, wait, the sounds, got really quiet. What's going on? And then they see something. So very, very interesting point to make. It's a small point, but it's an important one because psychologically you would think the reverse. So, and again, they hear the branch snap, they hear that the things go quiet in the woods, and they hear something kind of running at them, stomping, and they think it was, a man with a knife or something, a psychopath. And then later they kind of come to the Bigfoot thing. So who knows? Another interesting thing, they find tracks, some with 5 toes and some with 3 toes. And again, in the South here in the United States, you will hear a lot of these 3-toed track sightings and experiences where people will come across tracks with 3 toes, human shaped and sized or oversized prints with only 3 toes, not the 5 that are typical of Bigfoot. So the swamp monster trope, you have Honey Island swamp monster or the Boggy Creek creature. You hear a lot of these like 3-toed tracks being found. So it's weird that you kind of have 5-toed and 3-toed. They don't talk about how big they were. They talk about when they went back, they found like child-sized bear footprints, bare feet, not bears, human feet that don't have shoes on them, following their footprints. So juveniles, maybe babies, or it could have just been kids in the woods not wearing shoes. This was, in the past, and people are in the woods and sometimes people want to walk barefoot. So very possible. When his friend saw the shadow in his yard of the creature, to me, that's something I would tend to throw out, or just not say that they're lying, not say that it's not good evidence, but it's not great evidence. It's just they're kids. Even if they're teenagers, they're still impressionable. And if they got Bigfoot on the brain, like I said, that at that point, anything spooky, a spooky shadow outside can, in your mind now become Bigfoot. So that one, not too impressed with. The bus stop sighting, again, they see something that is sort of cone shaped and it stands up. And that part got to me because we do hear that a lot. People will say, oh, look, that weird tree stump over there. And then the stump stands up and walks away. And you're like, oh crap, that was not a tree stump. That's Bigfoot. But again, it's one of those things where at first you're not thinking Bigfoot. You're just sort of noticing something like these kids did, like, oh, there's this mound of dirt there. or something, and then it stands up and moves away. They're not necessarily thinking Bigfoot, but if this all happened within 4 months, then yeah, Bigfoot's on their mind. So everything is going to be Bigfoot. But that's interesting because I don't know of a person who's going to do that. Could it have been a bear? Possibly. Um, but they're saying that the creature was estimated to be 7 foot tall and quite skinny with wide hips, arms down to its knees. Again, a bear will stand up, but it's not going to walk off for an extended period. It's going to take a couple of steps and go back down. So they didn't say that happened. They're guessing that it was white, so possibly an albino. Very interesting. The howls, as I mentioned earlier, they're hearing like two voices. And he does go on to clarify a high pitch note that turned into a low pitch note, which is very similar to what I heard. You know, it's the high pitch moving into a lower pitch or a lower pitch moving into a high pitch. But again, some people will say it's almost like concurrent. It's almost you hear the high squeal and this low guttural thing at the same time, and it's just one howl. So I don't know. This almost sounds like it mutated. It went from a high pitch note down to a guttural, but still interesting. So yeah, I'm not sure what to make of this one. Again, there's elements of it that are really intriguing to me and tell me that maybe these guys did see something or encounter something. And then other parts of it, it makes me wonder if it's just Bigfoot on the brain and everything they were seeing or hearing was now Bigfoot. Every weird, imprint in the mud is a Bigfoot footprint, and every weird creature in the woods hooting or howling is now Bigfoot, and every shadow is Bigfoot. Not sure. So again, on the fence about this one. Elements to the story I really like, elements that I kind of have to dismiss, not because I'm saying they're lying, and not saying it's definitely not Bigfoot, but it's just too easy for it to be psychological trickery of the mind. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Okay, everybody. So I hope you enjoyed these Bigfoot stories from the Atlanta area. Again, there's no Bigfoot in Atlanta, but in the surrounding woods and counties and wilderness areas. So very cool. If you guys are listening on audio like Spotify or Apple, please leave us a review. Please just give us however many stars you think we deserve. The reviews really help us. It helps the algorithm. If you're watching on YouTube, comments, please. I love talking to you guys. You guys have some really cool comments, witty, insightful. You guys make me think sometimes. So please, any comments you have, feel free to leave them. Again, just be respectful. But I'm happy to disagree and debate respectfully and intelligently. And subscribe to the channel, please. It again helps the algorithm, builds our audience. Click the little notification bell. This way, anytime I upload a video, you get the notification. You can watch it. Like the video, give the little thumbs up if you liked it. If you didn't like it, give me the thumbs down. Or you don't have to. Just move on. So yeah, I appreciate all the feedback, guys. Thank you for everybody who's checked in on me. I had my health issues, which I'm still battling with. They're not terrible, but I'm still kind of working on getting better, back to 100%. But thank you everybody who saw my Facebook posts or watched the episode last week and has checked in on me privately. I appreciate you guys more than you know. And until next time, everybody, question everything. Like I question these stories. Not saying that these people are lying, not saying they didn't see what they saw, but we have to question. We have to say, what could this have been? It could have been a bear, because like the one person said, there were no bears in Georgia, and that's not true. There are bears there, maybe not that particular area, but they could be wandering through, and that's possible anywhere. And a lost bear is much more plausible than an undiscovered 8-foot tall primate. As much as I tend to believe in Bigfoot, I have to go with Occam's razor here and go for the most plausible explanation first. But what she saw did not sound like a bear, and I don't think she saw a bear. I'm just saying bears are in Georgia. So again, that's why it's important to question things, not to disbelieve. I'm not saying you have to be a hardcore skeptic, but you have to question. So that's the motto of the show: question everything. And we'll see you next week, everybody. Rock and roll.